Yeah, to them as well then. You know? Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry.
Great. I think we're all ready to go. Thanks once again, ladies and gentlemen, for staying. It's the end of the long day, and it's going to be even longer now, because we're going to go back in time and look at the migrations of people in and out of Ireland, and all in the space of an hour. Can you bear the suspense? It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Gerard Corcoran, who is the Irish representative for the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, who've organised this series of lectures, and he's sponsored by Family Tree DNA. So Gerard has been involved in genetic genealogy for quite some time. He has advised people like Ireland reaching out on what DNA studies they should be doing, and is very, very active in advising people who want to, advising corporations about how to actually do DNA testing. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Gerard Corcoran.
Thank you, Morris. Hello. So up to now, we've been looking at finding cousins and matching close ancestors. What I'm going to be talking about is our distant ancestors, or our deep ancestry. And I've created a lot of research topics on the Pinterest board. Some of you may be familiar with Pinterest. It's a great way of doing research, because when you come across an interesting paper or a scientific or academic topic, you can pin it and pin the relevant facts about it. Up to now, we have about 1,800 research topics on the board in about 80 different areas. And they're mainly related around ancient Irish ancestry and migrations into and out of Ireland, with a stronger focus perhaps on the Celtic migrations, because as we saw yesterday with Professor Dan Bradley and with Patrick Guinness, that makes up about 60% of the DNA in Ireland. So what I'll go through first is look at the research topics which we've been working on, which include migration starting at the beginning, which is the Ice Age, going into Neolithic Age, the Mesolithic Age, the Bronze Age, Copper Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, into early Christian Ireland, the Celtic monastic movement, late Gaelic Ireland, the Viking invasions, the Norman invasions, the later Tudor, Elizabethan, and then into the Williamite and Cromwellian period, into the 18th century and the Georgian period, the Victorian period, the Great Famine, of course, which was the outward migrations. Okay, so that's looking at all of the various potential areas of inbound and outbound migration from Ireland. And then I will look at some of the DNA related to those migrations. So we look at the major haplogroups in Ireland, which are related to Ireland, and where they are found around Europe, to see, can we get some clues as to where the people who are now in Ireland came from. And then thirdly, to make it a little bit more personal, I will look at my own particular DNA case. And I've tested with 4 different companies, and each of them has a different particular viewpoint on it. Some are stronger in ancient migrations, some in more recent migrations. And then finally, to bring it down to the human level, what does this mean to real people? And one of my objectives for doing this is, in Ireland we have 5 million people living here, but there are 70 million of us around the world. It's a huge proportion of a diaspora, a global diaspora. So if we can connect the people in Ireland with the global diaspora, that's something of benefit. And this year I had the occasion to do that by organizing a gathering of my DNA cousins to come here to find their long lost roots and hometown. So these are some of the topics you will find on the Pinterest board. One of them is a recommendation of all of the books which are related to this subject. There are several cases of that, mainly from the major authors in Europe, Professor Barry Cunliffe, Professor John Koch, any of the books which are interested in this area, all of the Irish genealogy books. So I think there are about 30 examples of very major works which are relevant to this area. Many of the books are quite large. Some of them are purely academic, more of them are geared to a more general public. One of them is very large, it's about this size. It's in 5 volumes, it's got 3,500 pages. It comes in 9 books. It's the Great Book of Irish Genealogy, which is crammed tight with very concise ancient genealogies of Ireland. The second one is on some of the videos and these are mainly from the BBC and RTE, very good series about the Celts, about the different migration periods in Ireland. There's an excellent one about Cromwell period and the migrations to Caribbean and so on and so forth. The Ice Age was a very important and formative period in Ireland. It's the time when after the Ice Age, the repopulation began. Of course, the sea level was much lower during the Ice Age, which allowed a land bridge to form between Europe and Britain and Ireland, and also the continental shelf between the Atlantic seaboard to Ireland was very, very low indeed. So after the Ice Age, it permitted a certain amount of migration to happen. And at the edge of the ice sheet, it deposited large amounts of gravel from what is today Dublin to what is today Galway, and that's called the Ishkarida. And this was a definitive, very important passageway in Ireland. And the other north-south boundary was the Shannon River. And where the two met, you find Clonmacnoise, and this was the centre of Ireland and became very important later on in Irish history. The Mesolithic age was the hunter-gatherers. These were people who populated Ireland after the Ice Age. We find many examples of it up in Antrim, in northeast Ireland, but we also find them along the Shannon. The Indo-European, we have to have a look at what was happening with the Indo-European, because we are an Indo-European people. And where did the Indo-European people come from? There are many theories about this. Some are from Anatolia. The most recent one is that it came from the steppes, or the mounted horse warriors from the steppes, from the Caucasus, and so on and so forth. But there are many different theories about the Indo-European. There were also Indo-European people who came westward and northwestward across Europe, but many of them also went eastward, and we find Celtic-type people in the Tarim Basin near China, and the mummified people there wearing tartans and having red hair, and to have genetic similarity to the people in Alpine Europe at the moment. Neolithic age, very important era in Ireland, with the development of the megalithic.
I think the batteries have probably gone on that, so I'll give you this for now.
Okay.
While I recheck this.
Okay, thank you. The Neolithic period in Ireland, with the development of the megalithic structures, including Newgrange, Note, all of the great Neolithic structures in Ireland. And of course, Ireland wasn't unique in this. There were Mesolithic or Neolithic structures or megalithic structures found all along the Atlantic facade and around the Mediterranean and also up into Scandinavia. And this will give us certain clues about some of the migrations into Ireland. And then a very, very important period in Irish history was the Irish Bronze Age. This was, we had one of the largest copper mines in Europe was to be found in Ross Island near Killarney. But the absolute largest copper mine in Europe at the time was a place called Rio Tinto. And it still is a very large company. And that was to be found near Tapesos, or near Puebla, in the south west of Portugal. And we have the Celtic migrations. Where did the Celtic people come from? Were they one homogeneous people? Were they different types of people? Did they have different types of languages? And we'll have a look at what we call the Atlantic Celts, the ones who are to be found on the Atlantic facade, the ones we sometimes call the River Celts or the Alpine Celts, who are to be found. These are the ones in classic Iron Age history we know as the Hallstatt and the Tenne Celts, and also the Central European Celts, who are further east. Right? Were they all one homogeneous people? Did they speak the same language? Do they have the same DNA profiles? And we look at the Irish and Celtic migration. So this part on the DNA here, and of course you can find all of this, it's very, very detailed. We have any study which has been done in DNA relating to Irish DNA or to Celtic DNA, or it's to be found here. And I've done a lot of analysis on extracting the data, doing hotspot analysis, and one of the first, when the big studies came out in 2010, one of the big things that popped out at me was that the highest percentage of the R1b output type, which we saw yesterday, is to be found in Ireland, and the highest percentage of that is to be found in the west of Ireland. And this was consistent for all of the defining mutations of L21. So the father of L21 was P312, and the father of P312 was L11, and the father of L11 was L51, and the father of that was L23, going back right to Anatolia. So this is showing a westward. It's almost like a wave effect, where we're finding that the end of the line was pushed from Eastern Europe or Southeastern Europe in a northwestern line, and it ended up along the Atlantic seaboard. And this one is more specifically not about Celtic DNA, but this is about Irish DNA signatures. We had a separate session on that yesterday. The Irish Iron Age, this is the typical, this is where you find most of the mounds and the architectural remains of the Celtic forts and so on and so forth, of what we've traditionally thought of as being Celtic. And this is the Hallstatt and the Tenne Celtic period. Early Christian period, this is the period when, around the time of Niall of the Nine Hostages, when he was going off raiding into Britain and probably into France and so on and so forth, and even causing the displacement of people from the southwest of Britain over to Brittany. Some people said it's the Romans that did that, but there are also theories which said it was the raiding parties from Ireland which caused some of this displacement. And then this is a very, very interesting one, the Irish Celtic monastic movement. This is when the monks in Ireland went abroad. They set up literally hundreds of monasteries all over Europe. Last year I happened to live in Munich, and I spent most of the weekends visiting some of these monasteries, like St. Gallen or Salzburg or Lake Constance or Regensburg, and there are literally 50 in the Bavaria region. Many of them are UNESCO heritage sites. These are absolute magnificent buildings. The St. Gallen Library has row upon row. It's a bit like the Trinity Long Room, and half of the books are in the Celtic script. And then at about 1100, you get into the Germanic script. So it's quite amazing to see the influence and the traffic which was happening between Ireland and continental Europe during this period. late medieval period. This is the Gaelic period just before the Viking period. It's also very important to have a look at Irish Celtic myths and religion. They brought the Celtic gods with them, Celtic goddesses with them. They also had, there was a strong tradition of genealogy in the Celtic world, which meant that there was a druidic tradition, there was a bardic tradition of passing down genealogies from sort of generation to generation. Oops. And then we go to the Anglo-Saxon period. Let me see, are we, oops, Iron Age, right. Okay, there's one part on Celtic history in maps, and I've collected as many maps as I could find in the literature and posted them there. And they show we're finding archaeological findings of, for instance, very important one are shields, where we find common types of shields throughout Europe, and it gives indications of common people or pots or different type of pottery. Irish language is very, very important. There's a major study underway by Professor John Koch of the University of Wales, and it's looking at the origin of the Irish language. And the newest theory, he and Professor Barry Cunliffe produced a major work recently, which was Celtic from the West, and the theory is that it emerged from the Tartessus region of Iberia. Celtic clans look at all of the clan structures in Ireland, and I think Dr. Tyrone Bowes addressed this earlier. He showed how he could map using DNA testing onto particular clan names or particular family names. This is the Great Book of Irish Genealogies. It's about, I think, 3,500 pages, thousands of names and thousands of genealogies. It was written down in the 1600s by Dubhtach MacPhershach. It was translated in 2004 by Professor Nulligo Morala, and it's a seminal work on Irish genealogy. It's been largely unused up to now because it's just in the book, it's not online. Hopefully someday we'll be able to get it online and to link it into the DNA phylogenetic trees which we are working on at the moment. And in this section there are as many ancient genealogies as I could find, which may be able to help you in your family DNA research projects. Irish, Scottish and Scottish kings. This is a listing of all of the Irish and Scottish kings in the literature. One of the things I found was that most of the Scottish, there are 50 Scottish kings from Kenneth MacAlpine right down to Malcolm III, including Macbeth, including Duncan. They're all buried up in Iona Cemetery. And most of them are in unmarked graves because all of the stone markings have sort of eroded, you know, and no one knows where they really are. A map was never drawn on it. So when Professor Bradley said yesterday that the next focus would be on ancient DNA, I said to him, well, this would probably be a very good project to undertake to identify where these people are. If we spend so much effort on Richard III, there's probably an opportunity here to identify 50 of the kings of Scotland, Ireland, and Norway who are buried in Iona Cemetery. And this is a database of Irish castles where each of them are and where they are located and which clans or which groups they were associated with. Many of them are Norman castles, some of them are Irish tower houses. Irish Viking migrations, very, very important period. It disrupted the Irish monastic movement. It brought new DNA into the country, as we know. We identified some of that was the I, and some of it was probably R1A, as we saw in the lectures yesterday. One very interesting aspect of this from a genetic point of view, they did analyze the DNA of the entire population of Iceland. And they found that 60% of the maternal DNA of Iceland was similar to Ireland and Scotland. And 70 to 80% of the paternal DNA of Iceland was related to Norway. And the explanation is that the Vikings, when they came, they took away slaves, Irish women slaves, they brought them to Iceland, and now Iceland is populated by descendants of Irish people, which is quite interesting. Later in the 12th century came the Norman migrations, and again this was a new genetic signature. We saw again with Dr. Bowes' lecture yesterday or today that he could identify which were the signals from the Norman names and would be able to map those to areas surrounding the Norman castles. So that's a very, very important tool because the Normans left a very strong architectural mark on the landscape. And then we were moving more into the Tudor period and more into Anglo-Saxon period and the plantations. And of course, the biggest disruption of all was in the 17th century, where the population of the country went from possibly 1 million people at the beginning of the century to about 500,000 people at the end of it. Right? And this was through either death or famine or pestilence, but more often to shipping people out to Barbados, the Caribbean, to Virginia, and places like that. And I know that Morris has a very interesting project which is called ICARA, which is to try and redress some of that history and reconnect some of those people back to their homeland. And this was a very important period because it also coincided with the flight of the earls. So the nobility of Ireland left. They went to France, Spain, to the continent. They excelled in the wars there. They were awarded large estates, and many of them became grandees on the European continent. There's another one which is very dear to my heart, which is the Irish wine geese. And I spent 20 years in France, but some of those I spent down in Bordeaux. And 20 of the absolute best wines of France are what we called wine geese wines. So you've got Lichbage, you've got Kirwin, you've got Talbot, you've got Walsh, and so on and so forth. And even Haute-Brion, which sounds very French, but it's actually O'Brien, right? And so these are some of the great wines of France. And these were all founded by members of the wild geese. Many of the wild geese went into the regiments of France. They founded the Régiment Français, and Trinity College have a very interesting database now where they have the names of all of these people who joined the regiments. And I think that'll be an interesting DNA project for the future, which is mapping or matching. Once France tests it a little bit more in DNA, matching some of these people back to their homeland. Irish Scots migration, very, very important. The people, they generally left before the major, what we call the Catholic migrations from Ireland. These were generally Protestant Presbyterian from Northern Ireland. They generally left earlier, and they were amongst the frontiers people of America. They settled in the Appalachia in Tennessee, and they were renowned to be very strong, very rugged people, and they were the frontiersmen. Daniel Boone was one of these Scots-Irish. And many of the presidents of the United States, including Jackson and so on, and Andrew Jackson, came from this particular community. Irish Huguenot and Palatine movement before the Battle of the Boyne. There were many Huguenots who had been oppressed in France, who were encouraged to come over. Some of them joined the Williamite armies. They won at the Battle of the Boyne, and they were awarded lands, some of them down in Wicklow, Rathkeil, and so on and so forth. And the descendants of those people are still there. Same with, a little bit later, the Palatine people faced the same problem, religious discrimination in Germany, and they were pushed further north, and they settled in areas of Limerick, and they brought their skills, which were in farming, they brought new skills in terms of textiles and farming to that particular area. The Georgian period was the period of the penal laws. Many of the wild geese had left already. They continued leaving during this period, and this was the period we call the ascendancy. And then we move into the Victorian period, again marked by many famines, and of course the Great Famine. But many people don't realize that the Great Famine had less of an impact in terms of the percentage of population who left than in the 17th century and the migrations which happened then. So I'll go through these very quickly. Let me see. Okay. There's also a database on the great houses and gardens of Ireland, which gives us some more elements to look at. The Irish diaspora, this is mainly the diaspora which emigrated to the US and to Australia and to Britain. There are about 40 million people in the US who belong to the Irish diaspora. Many of them went in, including one of my namesakes was General Michael Corcoran, who founded in the Civil War one of the famous Irish Brigade there. But many of the Irish immigrants who went to America, they immediately joined a regiment, usually for the north, some of them for the south. Some of them were fighting against each other in battles during the Civil War. And generally after the war, including some of my ancestors or some of my relatives, because of their service in the Civil War, they were granted land in the US, either out in Wisconsin or Minnesota or places like that. This research part here is all about the famous Irish Americans, the Kennedys, and the Clintons, or so on and so forth. And I think I even have President Obama there, who has a certain amount of Irish ancestry. He came from Moneygall. And then we move into the Irish period, the Irish modern period, the architectural heritage, Irish history, Celtic music. I'll move along a bit quickly. There's a database of Irish history maps, so for at least each century, from the 1st century right to the 21st century, there's a map of names of each of the clans which belong to each of the regions of the country, and it gets more and more granular as you advance in time. There's also an equivalent one for Europe history and maps, because we were very, very closely related to Europe. For instance, with the monastic movement, this mainly happened in the Empire of Charlemagne. So the Irish monasteries were brought up, they were part of the infrastructure of learning and development that Charlemagne put in place in order to build his empire. So the development of Europe History Maps shows that very clearly. There's the information here about Tyrone Bowes' project Irish Origins, and also the Irish Genetic Homeland Project. This one is Irish Surnames and Maps, so I've collected all of the maps, including some award-winning maps from the ESRI, which maps family names to particular districts, towns, counties, regions, and so on and so forth. The Ireland Reaching Out project here is an interesting one. About 4 years ago, I wrote a position paper to the Department of Foreign Affairs on the Irish and American Strategic Review. And one of the recommendations we made, and some other people made them also, was that we should focus on the diaspora, do something for them, use genetic genealogy maybe to connect with them, and to set up a reverse genealogy system to do it. A number of projects came out of this initiative. One of them was the Ireland Reaching Out project. So the idea is that every parish in Ireland, and we've got 3,600 parishes, would have local volunteers who would research their genealogy and find the people who left. So it's not the Americans trying to find out where they came from, it's the Irish villages finding out who left. This is called reverse genealogy. And we recruited about 800 volunteers. As of a few months ago, there were 800 volunteers in most of the parish clusters. And one of the initiatives we did was the Ireland DNA Roots project, which would find the most, the oldest, not the oldest, the person with the oldest connection to that parish, who could trace their ancestry back a long time, and we would sponsor a test for them. Each village would sponsor a test, and the idea is to create a reference database so that we can know by parish what is the genetic blueprint, if you like, by parish, and there are 3,600 parishes in Ireland. There's another project here, which is more of an academic. This is a community-based project. It's a grassroots project. The Irish DNA Atlas project is a academic project run by Dr. Giampiero Cavelli, an Irishman from Connemara. He also worked on Dr. Bradley's team, and he was instrumental in discovering M222, which is the Nile marker. And he has done that in partnership with the Genealogical Association of Ireland. And they've recruited, the progress has been a bit slow. I think they only have about 100 volunteers so far. So I would recommend to anyone who would like to participate, go to the GSI stand down below. And if you have 4 grandparents born in the same general area within 30 kilometers, volunteer for that, and it will be contributing to the development of genetic genealogy in Ireland.
It's 8 great-grandparents.
8 great-grandparents, that's correct.
But it's free.
But it's free. And it will be published in a peer-reviewed journal, so yeah. Again, this is Morris's project, Irish Caribbean Ancestry Project. It's an absolute great project. It's to find all of those people who were shipped out to Barbados or to Caribbean or to Montserrat, and somehow connect them back to their home villages in Ireland. The Irish Gathering was another of the initiatives, part of the strategic review, and that happened this year. And the idea was that based on we would invite members of the Irish diaspora back this year, 2013, to reconnect with their villages and their homelands and so on and so forth. There are thousands of events organized. I organized one of them, which was for my Corcoran clan. And we had a very successful gathering in East Galway in Clonfert. Global Diaspora Forum, another initiative which came out of the strategic review, and this was organised by the Deputy Prime Minister, or Taoiseach, and this was held, it was created initially by Hillary Clinton, and it's supported by the US State Department, but also by the Irish government, and it's held every year where we get together people on it. To have a look at some of the testing companies that I've tested with. One of them is 23andMe. This is for healthcare and for Ancestry, and they do a test. It's probably more interesting for people who are primarily interested in health results. FTDNA is the one which is pure ancestry related, which is very, very appropriate for genetic genealogists. Ancestry.com, they're coming at it from their base of traditional genealogy and millions of people having their family trees up on Ancestry.com. Ancestry are downstairs also. And Genographic, which is the first company I tested with, which was back in 2005. And they do deep ancestry. And they had a new test called the Geno 2.0, which came out last year. I was initially quite disappointed with it because it took so long, and we didn't publish the paper on time, and we didn't know where the SNPs fit on the phylogenetic tree. But in recent weeks, I've been absolutely blown out of by the new studies which are based on this chipset, and there's quite revolutionary things happening around this area at the moment. Tell me.
There's Lucas out behind you if you want.
Yeah. And okay, so yeah, so this is mainly, and I'll talk a little bit later about the Cochran Fan Reunion and that. So all of this information is online. As I said, there are about 1,800 research topics divided into about 80 research groups, and anything and everything that's possibly related to Irish migrations or the DNA aspects of Irish migrations is up there. So now we'll go and have a look at the finding markers which are relevant to Irish DNA. As we know, yesterday we saw Professor Bradley said R1b is the defining marker. Over 80% of people in Ireland carry this marker. It's the defining marker of Western Europe, and it's highest frequency in Ireland, and the highest frequency in Ireland is in the west of Ireland, and the highest frequency in Ireland is the furthest west. In the west of Ireland is as far west as you can go. So it's definitely a climb east to west. And this is the father of the Irish marker, which is L21. This is P312. Some people call it the Italo-Celtic marker, and this is a very clear Atlantic facade marker here. And this is the archetypical Irish marker, which is L21. Basically covers the Isles, but again, highest concentration Ireland, highest concentration west of Ireland, highest concentration west of Ireland on the Atlantic seaboard. Germanic, this is the other one, and this is a mixture of two. This would be the I, which we saw was the second most important one in Ireland, and but very much smaller than L21. Question of 2% as opposed to 70%, something like that, or 80%. And this is a blend of I and R1a, and this would be the Scandinavian and the North Germanic Anglo-Saxon signature. This would be explained by Viking invasions and also by the later Anglo-Saxon migrations. This one here is U152, and this is generally found around the Alpine area. I sometimes call this the river Celt marker, because this is the source of, near the source of the Danube, which goes down there, the Rhine, the Rhone, and so on, the great rivers of Europe. And these were the highways at the time, and this is how people communicated with each other. And for instance, the Loire goes from here right into this area here. So these were the highways, and these were how people connected between the Alpine region and the Atlantic coast, and also further east, the Danube right down to the Black Sea. This is the Germanic to archetypical 106 marker, which we see as the Germanic marker many people associated with the Anglo-Saxon migrations into England. This is the sister clade of the Irish one, DF27. Very important one. It's sometimes called the Iberian haplogroup because it's very definitely covering Iberia and southwest France. Recently, the National Geographic, they sampled 100 people in Mayo and 100 people in Asturias here. And they haven't released the results yet, and they're going to be very, very exciting, but I got a little preview of them. And it is very, very dramatic with a large, I can say that at the DF27 level, it's absolutely DF27. The Irish ones in Mayo, absolutely L21, we would expect that, but huge majority, over 90%. And very, very little of I or anything else. But the most important thing here is that the other most important marker was L11. And L11 is the parent clade of P312, which is the Atlantic clade. So this very much pushes the Celtic signature to the west. This is R1A, which is, as Patrick Guinness said yesterday, we can sometimes call this the Slavic one. This is the Eastern European marker. And we have some of this. This is L51. This is the father of L11, which was here. And so we find it over here. Very interesting along the Rhone, along the Alpine area, along the Po Valley. So this might have been a migration route. We also find it up here, very strange, along the Erne River. And I have a theory about that, but it's too early to announce it, but there's certain interesting implications for that. And this is L23, which is again the father of L51. And again, we see it goes back into the Balkans, and this is what we expect. This was the hotspot of the Neolithic in Europe. And there were two forces happening. One was the emergence of the Neolithic out of Anatolia, and the other was the emergence of the Bronze Age warriors and charts and horses and chariots and so on and so forth out of the Caucasus here. And so this, we many theories about it, but we think this was the blending spot for the Indo-Europeans, or the farmers and the Bronze Age warriors, who then brought it over here and then up to here, but they also came up through the great rivers of Europe. And this one here is an even more ancient marker, which is G, which is the one borne by Otzi, the Iceman. who was found in the Alps. And this is the early Neolithic signature. And this could have been associated with the megalithic cultures we talked about earlier. So it's quite possible that they arrived in Ireland, but they were replaced by successive waves of migrating people like the Celts. And here are some of the archaeological maps. This is from the LBK cultures. The early Neolithic or impressed wares, which we find along the Mediterranean facade. This is the bell beaker people. These were the people who created the pots, which had a specific format shaped like a bell beaker, and these were found at their burial spots. These are also associated with the Bronze Age metallurgy, and you find them at the Rio Tinto area here and Tartessos. And the very latest next generation sequencing study, which was released 2 weeks ago, studied an area here using ancient DNA, several hundred samples, and they found that Europe was not really a demic diffusion from Anatolia up to northwest Europe at one mile per year. It was several migrations. And those several migrations can only be explained by a corded ware migration from the east and a bell beaker migration from the west. And they identified those signatures. And there's a very good book that appeared again a few weeks ago. It's by Jean Manco, who's very active on the community boards, and her book is Ancestral Journeys. I'd recommend it highly for a good overview of migrations and DNA and architecture and linguistics in Europe. And her particular theory is that the Celts were really an amalgam of the Bronze Age bell beaker people who came from Iberia, but connecting with the horse-mounted Bronze Age warriors from the Scythian area. And these are later migrations of the Greeks. And what's important here is we're not expecting to be related DNA-wise to the ancient Greeks, but there's very strong connections between the Celtic people and the Phoenicians. And in fact, they converged again at this point here, and there was a lot of trading between those two communities. And of course, these were the Viking migrations, which had an impact on Ireland at the time. So if you summarize all of that, and we look at the various markers, we have the Anatolian marker M269, the next mutation L23, which is the Balkans, L51, which will be between the Balkans and the Alpine area, L11, which now we feel is probably further off towards Iberia, P312, which would be the Atlantic facade. L21 is definitely the Isles, but particularly Ireland. DF13 I see as almost a Gaelic, a mixture of Isles, but between predominantly Scotland and Ireland. And these are the terminal SMPs here, DF21 and so on. My particular one is here. So very good academic research on this is the work by John Koch and Barry Cunliffe. It came out about a year ago, Celtic from the West, but they've already updated it because the DNA is changing so quickly, and we have Celtic from the West. to now. So very quickly, I'll go through the rest. This is the ecosystem of the genetic genealogy testing companies that I've been using on this project. First one I did was National Geographic, then 23andMe, or then Family Tree DNA, 23andMe, Ancestry, and more recently I haven't taken Britain's DNA, but it's looking quite interesting at the moment. And I'm applying it to the Ireland Reaching Out project and the Ireland Gathering project and the Global Diaspora Forum. In order to do this, the biggest problem we'll be faced with soon is the overwhelming tsunami of data we will be faced with. At the moment, we're testing 12, 37, 67, 111 STRs. Already, we have 150,000 SNPs. Tomorrow, we'll have a million SNPs and then a billion SNPs per test. How do we deal with all this data? And so it's very important to look at the architecture of systems you use. The ones I've been using up to now, I use Pinterest for the research. But then we have 5 big internet platforms, which are extremely powerful platforms. Apple, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and Amazon. And each of them have different advantages. For instance, take Amazon, for instance. As many books as I can possibly do, I will read on Kindle because of the ability to highlight it and so on and so forth. Storage, you have Google Drive, you have SkyDrive, and so on and so forth. You have Amazon compute capacity, you have Google Mapping, you have Microsoft Business Apps, and so on and so forth. And one of the projects I'm looking at the moment is how do we integrate these big 5 internet platforms. So this is a quick look at some of the results I've had so far. This is the Geno 2.0. So I'm one of 600,000 customers, and I'm 2.1% Neanderthal. My wife would have said she knew that already. And this one tells me, but they're looking at very ancient distribution populations between the hunter-gatherer, the Neolithic, and so on and so forth. So North European 49, Mediterranean 33, and Southwest Asian 17%. But this is looking at very, very deep in time. It's not looking at 2,000 years ago. It's looking at 10,000 years ago. And it gives you this, which is you. This is my defining SNP, which is DF21, which is quite detailed at the moment. And all of these people here are my close matches, or the ones who have put some details about themselves. And the amazing thing I found when I was looking at it is that many of these names are the names which come up in the Gaelic genealogies of, associated with my surname. So Dr. Bowles this morning, he mentioned the Eli O'Carroll. And they were a clan, and they had 7 subclans, or 9 subclans. One was the Corcorans, the Flanagans, the Dooleys, the Roonies, and so on and so forth. And I'm finding these names popping up here. And that's quite amazing, because this is looking at deep ancestry. And this is my 23andMe result as normal. I think 100% European. I think most Irish people will find this. Many American people will have a different result because there'll be admixture between Germans and Irish and Italians and many different ethnic groups. This is what my FTDNA looks at. Or L21, in fact, I'm DF21. I've tested my terminal S&P, and H, on my maternal side, I'm H1C1. And this is 23andMe again, sorry. And this is the migration maps for Geno 2.0. This is the Britain's DNA results, and this is a standard result. It's not my result, but a standard result for someone in the Isles. And as you can see, a high proportion of R1B, and then I, and then R1A, and E, and so on and so forth. As you go into Ireland, this would be a much higher percentage of R1B and a smaller percentage of I. And then as you break down R1B, you find L21, U152, etc. And this is analysis I did, which none of the testing companies do, and I wish they would. It's of all the people you match, what is their haplogroup makeup, right? And this can say something about your family grouping. What is the signature of your family grouping? So most of mine would be 70% are O1B, we expect that. 16% I, O1A, J, and E. This is quite similar to what the Britain's DNA got. This is explained that some of my ancestors or some of my cousins went to America, and they married Germans and so on and so forth. So we're getting a more diverse signature. This is the breakdown of L21, which we saw yesterday. This is the work of Mike Walsh, and I'm to be found in this one here. And this is the breakdown of DF21. This morning I got an email from David Reynolds, who had just got his full genome Y in, and he has 300 more of these to do with, to find space for. It's quite amazing the evolution that's going on in the granularity of what we're able to do. 2 years ago, we were several layers up the tree trying to figure out what was the detail of our genetics. It's quite amazing the rate of evolution of this technology. Okay, bringing it down to human level, as part of the gathering, I organized my own gathering. The idea is that as many communities in Ireland as possible invite the diaspora back to Ireland this year. We'll probably repeat it in 10 years' time. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of gatherings organized, all great fun. The impact it had was 15% increase in US tourism. So it had a real economic benefit to the country, but it had a much more important human benefit. And this is one example of one of my matches on FTDNA. 5 years ago, I tested, and my highest match was a guy called Corcoran. Okay, that's good on my Y. And then I contacted him, and he lived in Minnesota, and he said that his ancestors came from Clonfert, where my ancestors came from, and yeah, so we started comparing things, and everything matched up. So we were cousins, but we had to figure out which cousins we were. And by the degree of comparison, we figured out that it was probably about 7 generations back. And then I also did a test on 23andMe, because he was also on that. And we found out that the amount we shared was just about 0.101%. And according to Morris's plan, that's about 7 cousins. And then we worked back through my ancestors. So myself, my father was born in 1900. He died in 2000. He lived to be 100. His father was Stephen, his father Thomas, his father John, his father Thomas, his father Hugh. And we know where they're all buried. They're buried in the beautiful Clonfert Cathedral, which is UNESCO Heritage Site. And Hughes had his son, Thomas, which was my line. He had another son, which we found on the gravestone, was Michael. And Michael had a son called Michael, and he had another son called Michael. So we have Thomases and Michael in the thing. And this Michael emigrated to the States, settled in Jessenland, Minnesota. His son was John Corcoran, his son was James, and his son again was Bill. Bill is 90 years old today. And this is Hugh, Michael, who married Mary, and their son John, who married Mary Catherine Scully, and his son James, and his son Bill. And Bill has 3 more generations below him. Okay? So we asked Bill to come over, and 25 of them came over, and we showed him the beautiful cathedral where his ancestors are buried. We showed him the gravestone of his great-great-great-great-grandfather. We took him to the farm, which is still there. We had a hoolie with about 50 of his living cousins, and they all had a great time. So that's what the gathering is about. It's about bringing people together. And so all of this genetics and the technology and the genealogy, in the end, it comes down to people. Many of the people here were crying when they saw the gravestone, when they saw the farm. And we awarded them a certificate of Irish heritage, it's a special one, which was signed by the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach. This is another case, an example, and this is my final one. On my Welsh side, my grandmother, Bridget Walsh, they were born in Ballymakeegan, but my grandfather was born in Clonfert. He rowed across the river to court my grandmother. In fact, the marriage was arranged by my granduncle, and he settled in Ballymakeegan, just across the river. And they had married Bridget Walsh, and the Walsh's grandfather, they had the family of Walshes who emigrated during the famine to Australia. And they didn't make it in Australia, so they continued on over to San Francisco. And within one generation, Thomas Corcoran, he became an architect. In fact, he became the most famous architect in San Francisco. He built 600 notable buildings, including all of the Catholic churches and cathedrals. And this year, through DNA, we matched with his great-great-great-granddaughter. And it just so happened that my sister was in San Francisco at the time. They met up, and now we have another wing of the family to invite to the next gathering. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gerard. You've taken us all across the world, so much so that they're going to kick us out of here any second now.
Okay.
So you'll be around again tomorrow?
Yes.
Well, if Gerard's going to be here tomorrow, if anybody wants to catch him for any questions, then please feel free. Thank you all for staying the length of time, and we'll see you again for day 3 of Genetic Genealogy Ireland 2013. Thanks very much. Good night.
I'm not too bad. How are you?
You mentioned the 4 cousins.
Really sorry for interrupting. I found that on the floor.
Oh, Grant. Grant, thanks
Sorry.
so much. Thanks so much. And you are? You're my fourth cousin once removed.
Once removed, you
I
explained
think.
all that to
I
me.
think. I'm not sure.
I think it is once removed. Yeah.
Oh, that's not
Jesus,
serious.
it's fantastic.
Oh, did you enjoy it?
Yeah, it was.
I'll have to do the experience in great detail next
Yeah,
time.
exactly. Yeah.
You can come up and do the other house.
Brilliant.
So you're back here again tomorrow then?
We're not here tomorrow, no, we're not.
Oh, right, okay.
So you're on for the 3 days.
Yeah, I'll be here again tomorrow to do the final round, the last laps, and then staying around for the rest of the week as well. So are you just up from Limerick?
No, yeah, we're just.
Oh, right, okay. You're going back down this evening.
Yeah, that's the plan.
Right, okay. So who won the rugby team?
I didn't. It sounded like Leinster were doing
Was it Leinster?
Yeah.
All right, okay. Yeah, well, they didn't disrupt us too much, which is a good thing, I suppose. Grand, okay.
And you. This guy's kind of keen to get the DNA done. We don't know which tests to do. So start small.
Goodness gracious. You're a what?
Yeah.
Right, okay. Well, if you did the spirit, if you did the autosomal you'd match me.
Yeah.
I think. Fourth cousin once removed, you've got a 50-50 chance of matching me, 50-50 chance of matching the other spirits who will be tested as well. If you want to go down the Walsh line, with your Y DNA test, because you've got your Y DNA from your dad, you've got it from his dad, so it'll go all the way back. You won't match me at all, you never have to talk to me again. So there's several options. I usually go for if you just want to dip your toe in the water, do the Walsh line, find out where the Walshans came from. Your experience were supposed to have come from Flanders.
That's right.
And before that, God knows where they came, but we came via London and then Flanders. Go to the Netherlands area, Flanders, North Netherlands, North Germany, Belgium, that kind of area. But the Welsh, they could have been, because Welsh means Welsh. Welsh could have been Brannock, they could have been from Wales, but they could be from somewhere completely different. So if you want to find out where your dad's crowd came from, I would do the Y DNA test. It's available for actually the cheapest test to do, I think, is the family finder, because the YDNA 37 is €99 downstairs, if my memory is correct. So the autosomal DNA test is only 79, and that takes in all of your ancestors. It only goes back 7 generations. So it depends really whether you're interested in the deep ancestry and where you came from thousands of years ago. If you are, then do the Y DNA test. If you're interested in just kind of looking for long lost relatives and hooking people up, trying to place them on your family tree, then the autosomal, I mean, €79, €99. You know, that's fairly reasonable.
And we could be cousins because we're Walshes from Callan.
There you go.
I'm just going to turn this off because it's still recording our conversation.